Did you know Australia Day was once celebrated on July 30th? Did you know Aboriginal people have been protesting on January 26 since 1983? Today, I am analysing the social media movement #ChangeTheDay. Let's get into it. Australia Day is celebrated every year on January 26, the day the First Fleet arrived in 1788. But for many, especially First Nations people, this is not a day of pride, it's a day of pain. In recent years, we've seen growing calls to #ChangeTheDate, a movement that demands Australia confront its colonial past and choose a national day that reflects unity and not invasion. In 2018, Amnesty International launched a petition joining the voices of Indigenous people and allies calling for change. Today, January 26 is also recognised as Invasion Day or Survival Day, with thousands taking to the streets in protest and even more joining the movement online. According to Twitter Australia, the use of #ChangeTheDate grew over 5,000% between 2014 and 2017. And it's not just a hashtag, it's a powerful form of digital activism that challenges dominant narratives and reshapes public debate. In this vlog, I'll explore how #ChangeTheDate disrupts mainstream media and public opinion and supports social media activism by applying 5 key media theories. Cultural hegemony by Antonio Gramsci, mainstream media and ideology, the public sphere by Jürgen Habermas, participatory culture by Henry Jenkins, and algorithmic culture by Ted Striphas. Together, these theories show how media power operates and how digital spaces are becoming tools for resistance, empowerment, and civic change. Antonio Gramsci's theory of cultural hegemony explains how dominant values are presented as common sense, not through force, but through media, education, and institutions. It's a subtle form of power that shapes what society accepts as normal. Australia Day is a perfect example. The date is officially framed as a celebration of national pride, with citizenship ceremonies, flags, and barbecues. But this framing normalises a colonial narrative, silencing Indigenous perspectives and their lived experiences. #ChangeTheDate challenges cultural hegemony, reframing January 26 as a day of mourning, survival, and protest. Indigenous voices now have the opportunity to add their side and stories to the dominant narrative. Social media platforms like Facebook provide Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with an avenue to share their truth about history and engage in activism to reclaim important cultural values. Through the lens of Antonio Gramsci's theory, controlling the narrative is about power, and in this case, digital platforms are a way of disrupting that power and encouraging diversity. We are aware that the mainstream media isn't neutral. It carries ideologies. It decides what's normal, what's relevant, and who gets to be heard. Ideologies are a set of beliefs, ideas, and attitudes, consciously or unconsciously, reflecting or shaping our understanding of the world. Research in racism, ethnicity, and media found that Indigenous Australians are frequently portrayed in mainstream media news as a threat to societal order and shown in context of conflict, crisis, and sensationalism. News stories are framed through pre-existing negative narratives, and news coverage tends to exclude Indigenous voices. In fact, the 1991 Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody report dedicated an entire chapter to how media contributed to the discrimination and injustice, explaining that racial bias in reporting is systemic, not individual. This also reinforces Gramsci's cultural hegemony, because mainstream media helps uphold these dominant ideologies. #ChangeTheDate is often described in the mainstream media as divisive or controversial. Political leaders have publicly rejected the idea many times. A 2021 national survey showed that only 28% of people support the idea of changing the date. This could be because of how the issue is portrayed by the news. This important Australian issue isn't just cultural, it's an ideological power struggle with deep roots in traditional media spaces. Social media platforms offer an alternative. Indigenous creators and allies use it to share truth-telling, educational content, and community stories, reframing the debate on their own terms without any media gatekeepers. Theorist Jürgen Habermas introduced the idea of the public sphere as a space where citizens engage in open, rational debate about issues that affect society. Ideally, this sphere is accessible to all, independent of government or corporate control. But in reality, that hasn't always been the case, especially for Indigenous Australians. Traditional public spaces like newspapers or parliamentary debate have often excluded First Nations voices, but social media is reshaping the public sphere, offering more people the chance to speak, connect, and organise. A study found that nearly 70% of activists see platforms like Facebook and Twitter as vital for reaching both other activists and everyday people. And that's exactly what we see with #ChangeTheDate. Digital spaces where protest footage, commentary, and truth-telling bypass mainstream media filters. Hartley and McKee go further, describing an Indigenous media sphere, a wider media landscape where Aboriginal people are no longer just subjects of news stories, but producers of meaning. They argue that the public sphere is being indigenised, as more Indigenous voices shape narratives about culture, identity, and resistance. Advocacy has allowed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to have a presence in Australia and not be dictated by others. And this isn't just about inclusion, it's about co-authorship. Real diversity in media means shifting from being talked about to doing the talking, and that's exactly what digital platforms have allowed Indigenous activists to do. Media theorist Henry Jenkins describes participatory culture as a space where people face low barriers to entry, are encouraged to create and share, learn from each other through informal mentorship, and feel that their contributions are valued. Even if they're not all active, everyone knows they're welcome to participate when they're ready. This is especially powerful for marginalised groups who historically haven't had access to traditional media. In the case of ChangeTheDate, we see a vibrant participatory culture at work. Protest art, TikTok memes, educational infographics are shared by thousands on social media. Creators like Paint It Black, Emma Garlett help engage broader audiences through education, including advice on having those difficult conversations if you don't want to celebrate January 26. Non-Indigenous creators also getting involved in the movement, advocating for the rights of Indigenous. Online creators are leading the way in shaping the conversation and promoting diversity in the media sphere. Jenkins also connects to participatory politics, where digital culture becomes a form of civic action. It allows people to engage in activism without needing institutional approval or media gatekeepers. He says young people raised within various forms of participatory culture want to exercise their voice, want to form meaningful connections, have a seat at the table, and reject the rule of political elites. As like Lumbie and Carlson point out, Indigenous people don't disconnect from their identity online. They use social media to embody it. Platforms like Instagram and Facebook become spaces for cultural expression and activism, where sharing a protest photo or inviting others to events is both personal and political. Participatory culture empowers citizens to co-author social change, and #ChangeTheDate is proof. While today's activists use online tools to push for change, there's a growing challenge. The digital platforms they rely on, like Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok, are not neutral. They are governed by algorithms and owned by corporations that can limit or manipulate what gets seen and shared. This brings us to Ted Striffer's theory of algorithmic culture, which explains how culture is increasingly shaped by automated decision-making systems. In other words, what we see online and what we don't is filtered by complex algorithms designed not for justice, but for engagement, profit, and control. For movements like #ChangeTheDate, this means activism can be silently suppressed. Posts may be deprioritized or flagged as controversial. Activists must constantly play the algorithm, using hashtags, trends, and viral formats just to stay visible. So we have a conflict. On one side, communities are trying to engage democratic digital spaces for truth-telling and resistance, And on the other, these spaces are subject to the gatekeeping power of platforms. Digital activism is powerful, but it's not free from systemic control. So what have we seen? The hashtag Change the Date movement uses digital media to challenge cultural hegemony, resist mainstream media ideologies, expand the public sphere, mobilise through participatory culture, and navigate the hidden systems of algorithmic culture. These theories reveal that the struggle for justice and representation isn't just about politics, it's about media power and whose voices are telling the stories. Social media activism is a powerful form of communication that builds community, challenges injustice, and creates real momentum for change. Hashtag Change the Date shows us how digital platforms can be used to educate, organise, and reframe national narratives from the ground up. When used with intention, these tools allow us to amplify voices that have historically been silenced. And that's where the future of communication lies. Thanks for listening.